Greetings from the Iranian Studies Unit of the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. I'm Mehran Kamrava. Iran's 13th presidential elections are coming up on the 18th of June. These presidential elections are of historic importance. Generally, presidential elections in Iran have had high voter turnout of around 67%. But for two specific reasons, these upcoming elections are of particular importance. First and foremost, there's a general sense in Iran that the elections might be boycotted, at least by large swaths of the population. There's a movement that people's votes don't really matter. And so on social media, at least in Iran, there's huge movement to encourage people not to vote as a protest against the Islamic Republic. Also important is the fact that in this election, more than one candidate from the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps has registered to run for the presidency. And so there's a good chance that Iran's next president would come from the Revolutionary Guards. Also significant is the fact that the reformists are really in disarray. The Iranian reformists have not necessarily presented a coherent platform and have not been able to put together a viable, exciting candidate. And we have yet to see if there might be a last-minute surge in terms of popular support and enthusiasm for Iran's reformists. Helping us better understand and navigate this complex upcoming election is perhaps the best expert on Iranian politics, on Iran's domestic politics, Professor Mehrzad Boroujerdi, who is the director of the School of Public and International Affairs at Virginia Tech and was previously professor of political science at Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. Professor Boroujerdi is the author or editor of the most important book currently out right now on Iran's post-revolutionary politics. The book is called Post-Revolutionary Iran, a Political Handbook, which I think is just under 900 pages, if I'm not mistaken. And I was just telling Mehrzad that in an upcoming publication, I'll have at least 80 citations to it. He's also the author of Mirror for the Muslim Prince in 2013, and the groundbreaking Iranian Intellectuals and the West, published in 1996. That has also been widely translated into multiple languages. In addition to his books, Professor Boroujerdi is the author of numerous journal articles and book chapters. He has been a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard University and at UT Austin, a visiting scholar at UCLA, president of the Association of Iranian Studies, a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute. If I were to list his many accomplishments, we would be here for the next 5 hours. So I'll stop there. And before I turn it over to you, Mehrzad, may I just ask that may I just tell our audiences, Professor Boroujerdi has agreed to speak for about half hour, and then we'll have a Q&A session through Zoom. If you have questions, you can submit them through the social media platforms of the Arab Center or the raised hand function of the Zoom, if you're joining us through Zoom. And also, both English and Arabic translations are available on the translation function of Zoom. So, without further ado, Mehrzad Boroujerdi, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Kamrava, for the kind introduction. Thank you to the Arab Center for this invitation. I'm delighted to be here with you and share some of my thoughts on the upcoming presidential election in Iran. I have, prepared a PowerPoint presentation because there's a lot of data I want to cover, and then I will be happy to answer your questions during the Q&A. So let me share my screen here and get going. As you know, Iran has a very short and sweet electoral process. As you can see here, registration of candidates takes place over a 4-day period. Then there is a 10-day vetting of candidates that is supposed to actually end tomorrow. And then once the list of final candidates is released, they have a few weeks to campaign for the office, and then June 18 we will have the actual election. So you're not really looking at a long electoral timeline in this regard. Okay, so this year some 59.3 million Iranians are eligible to vote in the election. And as you can see, compared to how things have stood in the past, this is sort of approaching a landmark, getting to the 60 million rate. So, it is amazing when you think about this. Look at 1980, we had 20 million. Now we are approaching 60 million. So 40 million new voters have entered Iran's electoral process after the revolution. And I think this is really one of the unknowns, right? Understanding the political behavior, the voting behavior of this generation, particularly the younger types that have, now perhaps getting the chance to vote, for the first time. Okay, then when we look at number of registered candidates, this is what you have in front of you. So 2021, as you can see, we notice a dramatic decline from the number of candidates over 1,600 that registered last time around in 2017. Part of this has to do with new restrictions put in place, but I think also it has to do perhaps with the fact that the level of enthusiasm is not where where it should be, right? So again, you look at 2005 and 2017. These were two elections where we also saw sort of a voter tsunami take place toward the end. But as you will hear me say later on, I don't quite expect that this time around here. As far as the actual number of percentage of candidates that get approved, here is the picture, right? You can see that what has happened is that, with the exception of the first election after the revolution, where there was a relative degree of freedom, and over 90% of the candidates almost who registered were allowed to run in the election. After that, the vetting process has become much more strict, so much so that now we are looking at a average percentage rate, approval rate of around 3 or 4% when they want to approve candidates for the office of presidency. Now, in terms of actual numbers of how many candidates were approved, again, this is the picture. So the previous one was percentage. This is the actual number. As you can see, over the last few elections, the range of final roster of candidates that were approved has been between 4 and 8. And again, my argument today is that we are going to perhaps see a similar number. My prediction is that we might get 5 or 6 candidates approved this time around, and I will explain why I think that's going to be the case. But that's the sheer number that we are looking at compared to all those hundreds, if not thousands, of people who registered to be the next president. Iran's politics, as I guess everyone knows by now, is really predominantly a male affair. And that's reflected also here in terms of the percentage of female candidates that have registered. So up until 1997, there was really no woman, not even one, who had registered to run for presidency because of the interpretation of what the law was. In 1997, we had the daughter of a well-known cleric by the name of Ayatollah Talabani registered because she wanted to call into question sort of these male-dominated nature of who qualifies to be the next president. And after that, the percentages have varied, but again, in single-digit numbers up to now. So that is the trend that we see this time around too. A total of 40 out of 592 candidates that registered in 2021 have been female here. And again, expectation is that none of them will be approved by the Guardian Council when the final list is published tomorrow or the day after. Okay, Mehran made a reference to former members of the Revolutionary Guards running for presidency. And again, if we look back at the last set of elections in Iran going back to 2005, this is what we see, right? In 2005, out of the 7 candidates that actually ran in the election, 4 of them were former members of the Guard, IRGC. In 2009, 2 out of 4, 2003, 3 out of 6, 2017, none, and 2021, we will have at least 1 or 2 here, depending on what the final roster is going to be. So these guys really have arrived, right? So the former members of the Revolutionary Guards have basically, abandoned their uniforms, have put on a suit, and have been running and contesting the office of presidency. And I think this is a feature of Iranian political life that we need to get accustomed to. This is sort of the way of the future. These guys are knocking on the doors and wanting to have a share of the pie. All right, let me say a few things about what I see as the weaknesses of Iran's electoral system. The first one I already made a reference to, right? We have only 25 days left until the election, and still we do not have the final list of candidates. So starting so late doesn't give people, a chance to really get to know, to be known by the population. I mean, imagine any candidate who is approved tomorrow. How can they travel to the 4 corners of the country and meet voters, right? Especially during the time of a coronavirus, to be able to, relate to the citizenry. So that's one, problem there. The second one, which I think is a bit even more serious, is the absence of political parties. So, because political parties in Iran are weak, they exist on paper. I mean, if you go on the site of the Iranian Interior Ministry, for example, you will see currently a list of over 200 political parties and organizations. But frankly, these are no political parties really in the classic sense of the word. This might be 2 or 3 folks getting together, forming a party, etc., very much inactive. And then come election time, they come out, put out a few flyers and posters and, make a presentation, but then, they go back to their sleepy mode, right, for the next 4 years. So it is really hard to speak of any serious political party in Iran. As such, the nature of political contest in Iran is really candidate-centered, right? And therefore, I think this is something to the liking of the regime that doesn't really like organized political parties and the contestation that goes on between parties. It is much better to deal with a system where you are dealing with individual candidates. You can tame them, intimidate them, or prevent them from saying some of the things that perhaps a political party was able to do. So that is a major problem here. Um, as you can see on the numbers here, this translates to the following problem. An unruly number of candidates, right? When I did my math, I recognized that over the last 12 elections, 5,361 candidates in total have registered for running for presidency, which comes down to an average of 446 candidates per election. Now, naturally, you cannot really run an election with this many candidates. Therefore, out of those 5,361, only 164, right? In the post-revolutionary period, only 164 individuals have been positively vetted by the Guardian Council to stand for election. So that's, a approval rate of 3% that we are talking about in this regard. So these are, I think, some of the structural problems. There have been a lot of talks, over the last 4 decades about changing electoral laws and regulations in Iran, but hardly anything really has changed in this regard. Okay, this is an interesting slide. You see, there is a lot of argument we hear that basically says if the Guardian Council approves and allows more candidates to run, you are going to have a higher voter turnout. The data really does not back up that assertion. As you can see, the black line here is the number of percentage of candidates allowed to run, right? And it has been, as we said before, very, very low, 3%, 2%, etc. But look at the zigzag that you see on the red line for voter turnout rate. With 1997, this is the election that brought President Khatami to office, and 2009, the contested election that gave birth to the Green Movement. Those were the 2 high points of Iran's, post-revolutionary elections. But as you can see, it has nothing to do with the actual number of candidates. It had to do more with the personality of the candidates and who the opposition candidate was. So we cannot make this sort of sophomoric argument about more candidates translates to better election. No, I think there is more into that chemistry that one needs to look at in this regard. Okay, so if I could go back, notice, by the way, what has happened after 1997. You see this dramatic decline, right? And then the same thing happens after 2009. There are good reasons for both of these events. When Khatami was in office, as you know, the reformists also won the parliament in Majlis, but really didn't manage to get their people re-elected next time. And therefore that caused a lot of disappointment and therefore a droppage in the percentage, as you will see in the next slide. But what I'm interested here is the following, that already, right, from 2009, we see the numbers, that have declined. And now this is part of my prediction as to why I think we will see a major downward, trend this time around in 2021 as well. So this one shows you the decline in the voter turnout for presidential election. This one is for the Majlis, right? And again, the one I want to draw your attention to is the number for 2020. Last year, Iran had its parliamentary elections, and participation rate was, around 43%. And this was before the pandemic hit, right? So if that's any indicator, 43% for the parliamentary election, which frankly can be more appealing in terms of people participation because of the local nature of voting in various provinces, etc. It is hard, I think, realistically to expect that we will get a better percentage rate in terms of participation this time around than we saw last year. So why do I expect a low turnout this time around? Well, I think, the first real reason has to do with the deteriorating economic condition of a rather disenchanted citizenry, right? When you look at inflation rate, when you look at the currency devaluation that has happened, the rising poverty, the crash of the stock market, et cetera, et cetera, these have given really rise to a lot of discontent on the economic front. We will get to the political front in a minute. So that's the first factor. The second factor, I think, has to do with the government's handling of the corona pandemic, the slow pace of vaccination, and the really inept and incompetent way in which the health ministry and the Rouhani administration has dealt with this crisis. Surely, coming out and voting in person in the middle of a pandemic. Remember, there is no, voting by mail in Iran type of thing. That's also going to take its toll in terms of the number of people who are going to come out, right? So third factor has to do with the nuclear deal. The Trump administration withdrawal from the nuclear deal and the finger pointing that has been taking place between the elite about who is to blame for that and whether JCPOA should be brought back or not, I think has also turned off a lot of the citizens. Because remember, the Rouhani administration really put all its eggs in the basket of this nuclear deal. And when President Trump withdrew from it, that basically pulled the rug from underneath the Rouhani administration in that sense, and it has been dealing with that issue. Now, this is on top of the other problem, which is the really abysmal performance of the Rouhani administration. People in Iran refer to the Rouhani administration as no government, meaning there is really no clear sense that anybody is in charge, or that if somebody is in charge, that they really have any authority to do anything meaningful. This is this for a man who came to the office, pointing out a key with which he was going to solve all the country's problem, has been really symbolically and realistically rather embarrassing in that sense. And again, I think it has contributed a lot to this sense of disenchantment and saying, why bother? Why should we vote? The next problem is the fact that the reformist camp that in the past really had some exciting candidates, to put out in front of the citizenry, etc. Some, interesting ideas. They were still riding the wave generated by Khatami in 1997 or by Mir Hossein Mousavi in 2009 and the Green Movement. Those reformists now do not demonstrate much excitement, right? You do not see serious candidates. You do not see interesting ideas that can galvanize the citizenry to come out and vote. So I think that's also another problem that we are dealing with. Finally, I think there is a problem about the circulation of elites in Iran here. You see, the people who are running for office are real insiders. I decided to look at the background of 35 of the best known candidates this time around, right? And I noticed that 45% of them have ran previously for presidency. So these are president wannabes, right? People who wanted to have the office, and they are real insiders. And again, for a citizenry that is disenchanted with the entire system as a whole, the question of voting for Mr. X rather than Mr. Y is not that appealing. So what do I mean when I say these are insiders? Take a look. I am giving you some info regarding 7 of the better known candidates this time around. I think the final roster we will see tomorrow will include a good number of these gentlemen whose name you will see in red in the left column, right? I have given you their age, their province of birth, and then I want to give you, some information about what type of offices they have held. But let's concentrate first for a moment, on the age factor, right? So you can see this is the generation of folks in their 60s, more or less, that are running for office right now. They come from different parts of Iran, including Iraq. So Mr. Larijani was born, for example, in Najaf due to his father being an Ayatollah there. This continues a trend. So far, right, in post-revolutionary Iran, we have not had a president who was born in Tehran. And chances are good that this time around, this trend will also continue. Okay, so first column is members of parliament. And again, you can see at least 3 of these guys have had many years of experience as a member of parliament. The next column is whether they have been cabinet ministers. And again, 4 out of the 7 have been cabinet ministers. One has been a vice president. The first vice president, Mr. Jahangiri, and Mr. Shariat Madari was a regular vice president, but not the first one. Mr. Larijani served for 10 years as the director of the Iranian radio and TV, right? Then the next column is membership in the Expediency Council. And again, you have 2 individuals here who have been there for like 24 years in that Expediency Council. That, by the way, is a council made up of sort of the elders of the regime, right? The white bearded guys who are supposed to know what is in the best interest of the Iranian state and make the final decisions and recommend them to the supreme leader. Next column is the Experts Assembly, which is a religious body of some 82 clerics. And again, Mr. Raisi, who seems to be the front runner this time around, has served there for 14 years plus 34 years in the judiciary. So this gentleman, entered the judiciary when he was very young, in his early 20s, and has been in that sort of post one after the other for the last 34 years. 2 of these gentlemen have also served in the National Security Council, and both of them have been chief nuclear negotiators. This is Mr. Jalili and Mr. Larijani. And when I say they have, and of course with Mohsen Rezai, he was head of the IRGC Revolutionary Guards for 16 years. So when I say they are wannabes, the next column, candidate in what year, gives you the year in which they have run. And again, the record here belongs to Mr. Rezai, who desperately has wanted this office and has been incapable of getting it so far. The next column, I think, is also quite interesting. So when these guys actually ran, how much vote did they get? What percentage of vote did they get? Because that can be an indicator, right, of what their level of popularity might be this time around. And again, you look at this column, and the gentleman who got the largest percentage of votes was Mr. Raisi in 2017, getting 38% of the votes, which was over 15 million. Look at, for example, Larijani back in 2005, only 1.7 million, or Mr. Jalili, 4.1 million. So that is, I think, part of the discourse, right? That says Raisi has the name recognition, has this base from the past that he might be tapping into moving forward this time around. Okay, now one of the other interesting features of Iran's political life is the following. When it comes to presidential elections, in the early days, in the first decade of the revolution, there was really no contest. It was crystal clear who the favorite candidate was, and therefore this person will win with a wide margin, right? So the purple here represents the winner, and then the red, the runner-up, and see what the margin was in the first decade of the revolution. Then as we get to the 2000s, etc., the margin is reduced a bit, right? So in other words, the contest between the winner and the runner-up is getting closer, more of a contest really, with 2005, which went to a runoff. That's why you have an A and B, there. Or in 1981, remember please, when a president was assassinated, then they had to hold 2 elections, in 1981. So this is not a mistake in that regard. Anyhow, so if there is a contest, then this becomes interesting. So this raises the question of, can this election in 2021 go to a runoff? The only time we have had a runoff was in 2005, right, when it was between Mr. Ahmadinejad and Rafsanjani going to the second round. Other times, the winner has gotten the necessary percentage of votes, to win outright. Okay, so some of the internal dynamics that I want to talk about this time around are the following. There are some really big names that are absent from this election, right? So, for example, Ayatollah Khomeini's nephew, Hassan Khomeini, was interested, but he was told by Ayatollah Khamenei to stay away, so he didn't, register. Some of the current, ministers, like Azariya Jahrami, Minister of Communication, Ghalibaf, the Speaker of Parliament, Zarif, the Foreign Minister, Aref, who was the presidential candidate for the reformist camp in a couple of previous elections, etc. All of these guys did not register for various reasons, this time around, which, I can go to during Q&A if needed. In terms of who remains, at least as of right now, in terms of exciting candidates, of course, Ahmadinejad, because, he is the loose cannon. You don't know what he's going to say in that regard. So, but 100% sure that he will be disqualified and would not be allowed to run this time. Masoud Pezeshkian is a medical doctor and a deputy speaker of Iranian parliament, who will be interesting, has very interesting ideas. And he can get the Azeri vote in Iran, but I don't think he is going to be approved, or if he is approved, I don't think he has the chance really to win the election. And then the most sort of outsider in this list for the reformists is Mr. Mustafa Tajzadeh, who spent many years in prison after the 2009 Green Movement. Is one of the whiz kids of the reformist camp. Has interesting ideas, but again, no chance whatsoever of being approved for this election. Now, this time around, the Guardian Council did something interesting a week before the registration was about to begin. The Guardian Council, by Iranian constitution, only has the authority to, oversee the electoral process and also decide on the qualifications of the candidates. But this time around, they decided to add a rather strict age range from 40 to 75. So if you were less than 40 and over 75, you could not register. They added having a master's degree as a requirement, etc. So things have become a bit more complicated, and there is no legal arguments as to whether the Guardian Council really could have done this thing. If so, this is going to be another first in Iran's electoral politics. As I mentioned, I think the reformists are now, with the exception of Mr. Tajzadeh, really without a candidate with wide appeal. I say about that in the sense of reformist candidates who might actually get approved. I think their choice is going to come down to these two individuals, Mr. Jahangiri, who is the present vice president of Mr. Rouhani, and Mr. Ali Larijani, the former speaker of Iranian parliament. Now, this is going to create a major dilemma for the reformist camp in the following sense. The reformists decided to vote for Mr. Rouhani in 2013 and 2017. These were not popular decisions, right? They were the more radical reformists who said we should not be, putting our support behind Mr. Rouhani, and look how he has performed, right? He has disappointed us. So these same guys are saying, Jahangiri doesn't seem to have the votes to, be the winning candidates. And so they're already thinking about, should we be supporting Larijani? Is it making the same mistake as we did with Rouhani? Will we be disappointed again? So there is this type of internal discontent within the reformist camp. Same story exists within the conservative camp. Now, it is fascinating when you think about it. For the last 20 years, the conservatives have not been able to agree on unified candidates, right? Notice, for example, in 2005, you had these three big names, Ahmadinejad, Ghalibaf, and Larijani running. In 2013, Ghalibaf, Jalili, and Rezai, in the list, etc. And this time around, again, a good number of conservatives, such as Jalili, such as Raisi, there. So the discontent also exists within the conservative camp as well. Okay, let me talk to you very briefly about some of the advantages and handicaps of the three top candidates as I see it, starting with the current first Vice President, Ishaq Jahangiri. So what is his advantage? The man has had 24 years of experience as a member of parliament, minister, and first Vice President. He is a founding member of the Party of Executives of Construction, and therefore these guys are going to support him. It is, there is a good chance that people like Khatami and Karoubi during the electoral season are also going to, give him support to help beef up his chances. Jahangiri, has served as a minister of industry and mining, so he really knows that sector of Iran's economy very well, and also as first vice president, he knows all the state affairs quite well, and having been in that position for the last 8 years. Finally, he's a very good debater. In 2017, in my estimation, he did the most impressive performance in the presidential debates that took place. So, he is able to perhaps, repeat that type of experience and again garner some votes. What are his handicaps? The unpopularity of the Rouhani administration. This guy is, number 2 in Rouhani administration, right? And therefore, I think the unpopularity of Rouhani is going to, taint him as well, and he's going to have that problem. He's also the oldest candidate running at 68 years of age. Then we have Mr. Ali Larijani. In terms of intellectual horsepower, I think he is the most impressive of the remaining candidates. He is very close to the supreme leader. He has served as the chief nuclear negotiator and also the gentleman who was entrusted with the task of, signing this memorandum of agreement recently with China. So he's an intimate, insider in that sense. He is able to recruit rather talented people, for example, like Jawad Zarif, to continue as foreign minister if he wants to. Handicaps, the man has a charisma of a doorknob, right? He is not a charismatic leader. He is not a good speaker. The other handicap is that the prominence of his family, meaning his brothers and the corruption stories that have circled around that family for a long time, is going to be, troublesome. So if you think of, Rafsanjani as a prominent Iranian political family, Larijanis are the second best in that regard. So I think that's also a problem. The third problem for Larijani, in my view, is that he really doesn't have the backing of any concrete blocks. Neither the conservatives are going to support him because he has tried to distance himself from them over the last, 2 decades. And also the radical reformists are not going to trust him because of his, past experiences. Now, Raisi seems to be, as I said, the front runner for all sorts of reasons. First of all, he has the backing of the conservative establishment, right? So Society of Combatant Clergy, the Office of the Supreme Leader, etc. The clerical establishment, in other words, are going to, stand behind him. And because, the Supreme Leader has really signaled the fact that, this is his favorite horse, in the race. And in case you're wondering, why would the current, head of the Iranian judiciary try to run for another office to lead another of the 3 branches? It's not a first. Remember, for example, back in 1981, we had Rajai, who was prime minister, running for the office of president. In 1989, Rafsanjani, who had been Speaker of Parliament, ran for presidency. Nater Nouri, same thing, from Parliament to running for presidency. and then Rafsanjani, who had a number of positions, for example, in charge of the Expediency Council, running for president in 2005. So Raisi is not doing anything strange in that sense. As I said, in 2017, he received 38% of the votes. He was the first runner-up, and therefore that 15 million voting block, might be something that he can tap into. And of course, he is a much better known commodity now compared to 4 years ago when he was, a relative unknown in that sense. I think he will benefit from the fact that a few of the other candidates in the race are going to drop out in his favor. So people like Jalili, Rezai, etc., or they are going to endorse him once they are disqualified. Handicaps for this man are also serious, right? He has a notorious past as a judiciary official, having ordered the executions of thousands in the late 1980s. His closeness to the supreme leader and to the arch conservative Ayatollah Alam al-Huda, his father-in-law, are also going to raise a lot of eyebrows for people who have heard the crazy things that Ayatollah Alam al-Huda has said. So this is going to give them pause for voting for Raisi. He is not going to be able to win the votes of the reformists or the middle class. That's going to be a tough sell. And finally, the man is really more of a prosecutor than a politician. He did not perform well in the TV debates, and I don't expect much improvement in that sense from him this time around. So he has his own, handicaps as well. Brief words on foreign policy. So what will be interesting is that if we see a win by the conservative candidate, then you see the sweep of all three branches of government by the conservatives. Even if Mr. Raisi wins, I'm sure the supreme leader is going to appoint yet another conservative to be the head of the judiciary. So all three branches will be in their hands. So this raises the question of what will be the commitment of Iranian leadership moving forward on the nuclear deal, on signing the FATF, remaining in the NPT, the China deal. What type of ramifications will it have for US-Iran relations? Remember, I don't think Iran can go back to the positions it adopted between 2005 and 2013 under Ahmadinejad, when he was saying UN, Security Council resolutions are, nonsense, and we don't care about them. Iran's economic fragility right now will not allow them to play that card. So they need to be, mindful of the negotiations going on with the US in this regard. Interesting other fact, if Raisi becomes the next president, he is on the US sanctions list, and there are also legal complications, whether he will be allowed to come to the UN General Assembly meetings and things of that sort, which we can get to later on. So here are my predictions based on everything that I have said to wrap up. I expect we will see tomorrow or the day after the Guardian Council approving 6 or 7 candidates. Why this number? Because they want the number to be big enough to generate interest, but also they do not want to see a real splitting of the vote, right? Because the last thing that the regime really wants is for the election to go to a second round where things might become really unpredictable. So 6 or 7 candidates, with the expectation that some of them will be supporting caste candidates. In other words, let's say somebody like Jalili might be there, he will take part in the debates to make the case for the conservatives, but when push comes to shove, he can drop out in favor of Mr. Raisi, for example. This is the exact role that Jahangiri played in 2017, being the backup to President Rouhani during that type of election. So, the numbers make sense. It might be 5 or 6, but no more or no less than this number. The next prediction, we will see again if this comes true or not, but I am really predicting, unless there is going to be massive voter fraud, we are going to see at best, based on my calculation, a participation rate of around 34 to 37%, which, when you compare to the fact that the average for the last 12 presidential elections has been 67, that's a drop of 30%, which is huge, right? So if we have 34 to 37% participation, this means 20 to 22 million people will participate. Why do I use this number? Because again, I am using as my indicator, the fact that in 2017, 41 million people took part, but more importantly, yet last year in the Majlis election, only 24 million took part. And so, expecting more than 24 million during Corona is something that I have a hard time, digesting in this regard. Furthermore, I expect that we are not going to see any last minute voting tsunami, despite the fact that Clubhouse has become important and has, attracted a lot of Iranian political junkies there. We are not going to see a voting tsunami. There is no movement afoot right now in that regard. Furthermore, I don't expect that we will see another populist candidate like Ahmadinejad in 2005 being able to win the election, carry the day. I don't see that. I say this, and I need to add as a footnote that I think the TV debates that are going to start, those are going to be important. They are going to be acrimonious, and depending on who performs well, those people who are willing to vote, I think, can be swayed by this candidate or that candidate, to come out and vote. If my predictions on the numbers are correct, this means the following. The winner needs to get at least 10 million votes to avoid a runoff, right? Because you need to get a 50% of the votes, to be there. So with that calculation, considering that Mr. Raisi got 15 million in the previous election, he has a better chance of, reaching that threshold of 10 million in my view. Now, this is not to say that he is going to win hands down. No, a lot of things really can happen that can make the outcome more contentious. So for example, let's say Mr. Jahangiri realizes that he does not have the votes, he drops out or decides to support Larijani. Then if it becomes a contest between Larijani and Raisi, which is my prediction, that these are the two foremost candidates, then it might be a different story. How would the middle class vote, right? Confronted with the argument that you have to choose between bad and the worst. Once again, do you want Raisi or do you want Larijani? This becomes important. But at this point, I don't expect that we will run into runoff elections unless those TV debates really starts to have that impact on the citizenry and change the current configuration of who is there. So in short, if I were to rank order people right now in terms of their chances, I would say Raisi first, Larijani second, and Jahangiri perhaps a distant third. So let me stop here and see what type of questions are there.
That was absolutely perfect. Thank you so very much, Mehrzad. I think you explained this complex process of elections only in a way that you can do. So thank you. That was absolutely brilliant. We have lots of questions already, and I anticipate there will be more questions. And I know some of these questions that have been asked already require long and elaborate answers. But if I may ask, just so that we can get to as many of them as possible, if I can ask that you keep the comments short. But if I may just ask a question myself first. We know that historically, from a comparative perspective, every time there's been a war, after the war, for example, in the United States, just as an example, members of the military become politicized and take part in the political process. So, for example, in the United States, a trend that can be observed is there are lots of Vietnam veterans who are members of the Congress and who become candidates for local, regional, or state or national elections. Why is it that when this phenomenon occurs in Iran in relation to the IRGC, for example, there's all sorts of discomfort and discussion? Is this not part of a broader trend that occurs comparatively for those of us who study comparative politics?
So that's a very good question, Mehran, and absolutely, it's a normal phenomenon. I mean, after all, these guys have served, let's say in the war, in the Revolutionary Guards, etc. So they have, made a name for themselves. So for them to running for office is normal. The part that is disturbing or might be different is the fact that their institution, meaning the Revolutionary Guard, might use its sizable resources to back up a candidate, which is not something we see in the US election, right? So, the US military is not going to say, I'm going to vote for such and such a person or advocate and really play an active role in promoting a candidate. So I think that's the worry about the Revolutionary Guard individuals.
Thank you so much. So in terms of some of the questions, there's a question about the role of the youth in the election, in influencing the election results, and also the participation of women in the elections. Are these likely to be deciding factors?
Frankly, I don't think so. For the youth, what I'm sensing is more of a sense of apathy, right? And sort of being fed all these sort of slogans and promises, and the government not being able to deliver. And therefore, I don't necessarily expect a huge, voter turnout among the younger, population. For the women too, I think, again, you think about all the factors that have rubbed them the wrong way, right? Whether it was, losing family members because of government's mishandling of the corona, virus, etc., not allowing women candidates in, etc., etc. I don't necessarily see a huge reason for their active participation. Notice, by the way, that the government doesn't, ever release, right, data based on what percentage of people voted, based on gender. So we never know, right, what percentage of those people who vote were actually female or not. So it's difficult to predict. But my sense again is that there is going to be less enthusiasm among women, among ethnic groups in Iran, as well as the youth this time around. So that's also part of my expectation for why we will see a low turnout.
Just to support that, anecdotally, last time I was in Iran, I was also quite surprised and taken aback by the level of youth apathy, particularly as compared to the 90s, late 90s, 1997 and 2009. The generation of the 2009 voters have become really disheartened and disenchanted with the political process, seems. There's another question in terms of policy confrontation with Israel. Is there likely to be heightened tensions between Iran and Israel in the aftermath of the elections?
Okay, so that's an interesting question. And I think, both in terms of Israel and with the US, right? If a conservative candidate come to office, right, they're really going to see some fascinating dilemmas, okay? On the one hand, the state of the economy cannot tolerate more of the same, right? So this sort of confrontational approach that we have seen in the past is not going to be sustainable for a long time, for the next 4 years, 8 years, etc. And on the other hand, if you really want to improve ties, right, with, let's say, the United States, you are going to be alienating that conservative base of voters as well. So the conservative establishment really has, a dilemma coming up. So far, they have been able to put all the blame on Zarif and Rouhani, but starting next month, you're not going to be able to do that, right? The Iranian political establishment is going to speak with a more uniform, united voice. And I think it's going to have a conservative accent for sure, right? This voice. But what is the range of realistic options, right? I mean, if I am working on the assumption that really things such as the nuclear issue or the relations with Israel is decided by the supreme leader, and therefore the choice of the president is not really that significant in bringing about a watershed transition in that regard. So I expect those things, the animosity toward Israel might go up in terms of rhetoric, but I don't expect that there will be, much change in terms of actual practice.
Thank you. Mehrzad, you mentioned something about the next question, but this phenomenon of social media, and particularly nowadays Clubhouse, in the last week, both Larijani and Ahmadinejad have been on Clubhouse. To what extent do you think this social media in general will be a deciding factor in the elections?
Yeah. So Clubhouse really has been fascinating, and in addition to those two, Mr. Jahangiri has also been on Clubhouse, and each time you have had thousands of people listen to these folks. I did myself. And so this is interesting because Clubhouse allows people to go, bypass, right, the censorship of the Iranian media and be able to really, pose some challenging questions to these, candidates, etc. So in that sense, it's interesting. Every time we have had an election, right, social media has played an interesting role. Remember in 2009, it was Telegram, for example, that had come as a new social app. Before that, it was SMSs, right, that were going around. So for that group of Iranians who are really interested in these political issues, etc., these mediums really provide an opportunity for them to promote their message, etc. And I think candidates are recognizing that you have to be on Clubhouse these days if you want to talk without any type of interference from the government authorities with your potential base out there. But at the end of the day, as I said, these are sort of the political junkies, right? Like us. I'm not sure that the Clubhouse, has become a household phenomena where the ordinary citizens, right, in a country with 60 million voters, that this is going to be enough to force them to overcome, right, their sense of apathy, their disgruntlement, and say, okay, I want to go out and vote. Besides, remember, social media and expatriate TV stations, I think, have really managed to formulate, a place for themselves that is impacting popular opinion, right? And therefore, if the message from these expat TV stations is basically telling people to stay away, it's no point going there, I don't think Clubhouse is necessarily going to be able to overcome that, considering their popularity in Iran.
Thank you. There's a question about the ongoing discussions between Iran and Saudi Arabia in Iraq. And this has been facilitated from what we know through the good offices of not just the Iraqis, but also apparently United Arab Emirates. And previously, Qatar has also offered to mediate between Iran and Saudi Arabia. To what extent do you anticipate regional tensions between Iran and Saudi Arabia might be impacted because of the elections?
Yeah, no, I don't expect really that, because I think the decision about a rapprochement with Saudi Arabia has been a decision that has been made at the very high levels of the Iranian political system, and the choice of the president is not going to change that. Look, it is advantageous to both Iran and Saudi Arabia to try to downgrade, right, their level of tension. There is a lot to be gained there. There, and of course, countries such as Iraq are standing to benefit, right? There is a saying that says, when two elephants fight, it's the grass that gets hurt, right? When you have a fight between Iran and Saudi Arabia, of course, Iraq gets hurt. So what I think, the decision about making some rapprochement with Saudi Arabia is a decision that the Iranian establishment has made at this point, and the choice of president is not going to change that.
Thank you. You mentioned that most likely Iranian politics will have a conservative accent. And let's suppose Raisi becomes president, just for the sake of argument. What do you anticipate domestic politics might be like under a possible Raisi presidency?
Yeah, so that's really the worrisome question for me, right? As to what type of policies will somebody like Raisi will adopt in terms of the domestic politics. What we see, over the last few years is the following: the frequency of protests in Iran has picked up. Right, 2019, 2020, 2018, we have seen successive waves of protests. And if the economic conditions deteriorate, right, then chances are you're going to see more of these type of protests, coming up. So far, the government's approach or the system, the regime's approach really has been nothing but suppression, right? They are not willing to meet these protests halfway, give concessions, right? Concede some points, open up the political space, or improve the economic conditions, so far. So with the conservatives, I think they are going to continue the blueprint that has worked for them so far. And that means, again, more repression, more crackdown, because you see, this is a regime that feels the threat to it is not going to come from outside. Despite all the rhetoric that we hear from the Iranian leaders, they know very well, neither the US, nor the Israelis, nor the Saudis, nobody is going to invade Iran or have a fight with Iran. That's not their concern. The one point of concern really is a social implosion, right, from within. That politics of discontent that I was mentioning. And unfortunately, it seems like right now the magical formula is more of the same, repression, etc. And with somebody like Raisi, in office, and assuming that his cabinet is going to be made up again of like-minded conservatives, then you can expect what the policy course is going to be, right? Which again is nothing to write home about.
Perfect. I thank you again for indulging us. These questions keep coming, and I'll just wrap up in 5 or 10 minutes with your permission. In 2009 and 2013, as you mentioned, TV debates, which had been unprecedented up until that point, sparked a massive interest. And so do you think that this is likely to happen again? These TV debates, particularly in light of the fact that Jahangiri, for example, proved so effective in 2013. Do you think they might be able to pull off a narrow victory for a surprise candidate?
So I think, as I said, the one unknown at this point, after we get the list of final candidates, is how well this candidate is going to perform in the national debates. Again, I expect Mr. Jahangiri to perform well. He is very sharp, has a quick wit, can come back and hit people. And remember, he's going into these debates being vice president, so he has been privy to all sorts of detailed information, right? So he can clobber his opponents with giving them fact after fact and correcting their assertions on that sense, which is going to help his popularity. But the question is, will that be enough, right, to give him that jump in the votes that he needs to get? I don't frankly see it, right? All the present polling that has been done in Iran shows him in single digits, right? So to go from a single digit to become the victor in the election is really a hard climb. So I don't quite see that. I think the fascinating thing really is going to be what happens and at what point Mr. Jahangiri might come to the recognition that he's not going to win it, and therefore he and his buddies have to make a decision about what to do with the Larijani candidacy. Support him or stay away, right? I think that's going to be the key deciding factor in terms of whether the contest really has a chance to go to the second round or becomes really close or not.
Thank you, Mehrzad. I'll ask the last question. Are the reformists a spent force in Iranian politics? Are they done? Are we seeing a tectonic shift in the configuration of factions and political groupings in Iran?
You know, I think it's still premature to call them a spent force, really, because I think they are still there organizationally. They're there. They know that their message can resonate more easily with Iran's middle classes than the conservatives, right? We know that for a fact. The problem that I see in the reformist camp is that their successive setbacks, right, over the last few years, particularly since 2009, right, with what happened with the Green Movement. The Green Movement, in my view, was the political heart attack of the Islamic Republic, right? And I don't think anyone has really adjusted well to life post 2009, including the reformist camp, right? So, you know, when you read their newspapers, when you read their position papers, what is the debates that are happening within the reformist camp, they're basically saying, now what? What do we propose? How do we show our base that our ideas about the possibility of reforming this system can really materialize, right? Or are we just daydreaming? Right? We have these wonderful ideas about, you know, making the Islamic Republic this democratic this way, etc. But then, you know, we currently have perhaps the most conservative Guardian Council that we have had over the last 4 decades, right? So, you know, if you deal with such a conservative Guardian Council that is going to vet the candidates, etc., you know, legislation by the parliament, what do? Besides, remember, we also have perhaps the most conservative, you know, or the second to most conservative parliament currently in Iran as well, right? I mean, you just look at the legislation that is coming out from you know, the current parliament, half-baked ideas, you know, full of rhetoric without really much, you know, content, right? So it's going to make, you know, the task of the reformists difficult. What are you going to say? I mean, last time around, right, in 2000, parliamentary elections, again, a good number of these folks were disqualified. So what this means is that the Guardian Council has really, I guess, figured out the formula for how do you defeat the reformists. You basically disqualify the top rate candidates, right? So they have to go to second and third class type candidates that nobody knows and nobody cares for, right? And so if you do not have that name recognition, if you do not have that, you know, resume, right, that sort of resonates with the citizenry, then the reformists are not going to be able to perform well. Besides, the other way you know, sort of reduce their voice and their weight in parliamentary elections is that you allow a good number of conservative candidates to also be running, right? So it becomes a crowded field, and the reformists are just one voice among a sea of these sort of conservative voices. I think that has been a brilliant formula by the conservatives to shout out the reformists. Remember also, as I said, I think unfortunately, they do not have charismatic leaders. Their last candidate was somebody like Mohammad Reza Aref, right? Who has been a first vice president, etc., a Stanford educated, you know, engineer, etc., with a PhD from Stanford. But the man has absolutely no charisma, none whatsoever, right? I mean, you're bored even having a 5-minute conversation with this gentleman. So, you know, I think this is the point at which the reformists need to go back to the drawing board and decide, you know, if they want to work within the confines of the system, you know, what exactly ideas do you have? And also, you know, who might be some more charismatic figures that can, you know, give you a realistic chance. The current slate of candidates, you know, really does not impress anyone, I think. And that's one big problem that they face right now.
Perfect. Thank you so very much. I can't thank you enough, Mehrzad. Thank you for explaining this. And just one last question. When the dust is settled in a year or two, or maybe less than 2 years, will you come back and explain Iranian politics for us at that point? Please.
By all means.
Thank you. This has been absolutely terrific. I'm very grateful to you. I'm grateful to my colleagues behind the scene who've made this possible. And thanks to all of you for joining us from around the world. Thank you again, and good day to all. Thank you, Mehrzad.